The orphanage was silent, except for the restless groans of wooden beams straining against the winter wind. Lantern light flickered along the walls, throwing shadows that stretched like blackened fingers across rows of narrow iron beds. In the farthest corner, where dust gathered thick and the air felt colder, one bed stood empty. In its place rested a coffin, plain, unfinished wood, the kind meant for paupers who had no one to claim them. Inside, a boy lay curled on his side, eyes half open, lips parted, as if whispering to someone unseen. His chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, not with the peace of sleep but with the waiting patience of someone rehearsing for death. The other children stared from their bunks, clutching thin blankets, too frightened to speak. Why would a child barely 10 years old choose the coffin over a bed? That question would haunt everyone who stepped inside those walls, for once asked, it could never be silenced. The boy had chosen his resting place not for a night, but for every night to come. And with each sunrise, the unease grew heavier, as though the orphanage itself knew something terrible had already begun. In the years after the Civil War, the American countryside carried wounds that never seemed to heal. Fields lay barren, families shattered, and countless children wandered without parents, swept into institutions that promised shelter but rarely offered kindness. On the outskirts of a small town, the orphanage stood like a monument to despair, its stone walls damp with mildew, its windows fogged with frost even before winter set in. Inside, life was a daily rhythm of scarcity. Mornings began with the clang of a rusted bell and the smell of bread so stale it cut the roof of the mouth. Bowls of thin gruel followed, handed out by weary staff who themselves looked half-starved. The children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, shuffled silently, their faces pale, their hands raw from labor. They stitched torn clothes, scrubbed floors, and carried water from the frozen well, learning early that survival meant obedience. At night, the dormitory filled with muffled whispers. Some prayed under their breath, others hummed lullabies remembered from mothers long gone. Lanterns swayed gently from iron hooks, casting pools of light too small to banish the shadows. In those shadows, fears grew of sickness, of punishment, of the endless winter creeping through cracked walls. The matron, a stern widow with sharp eyes and a voice that could silence a room, kept the place in brittle order. She believed discipline was mercy, that hunger taught humility, and that faith would see the children through. Yet beneath her rigid rules, the building itself seemed to resist comfort. Cold drafts crept under doors, strange knocks echoed at odd hours, and every so often, a child would vanish, claimed by fever or simply gone without explanation. Despite the cruelty of routine, it was an existence that had shape, one the children clung to. Beds lined in rows offered at least the illusion of safety, and the steady ring of the bell divided time into predictable fragments. But within that fragile rhythm, one boy began to disturb the silence. He did not cry at night. He did not flinch under the matron's gaze. Instead, he asked questions about death, about the graveyard beyond the orchard, about the wooden boxes stored in the cellar. Questions no child should carry in his mouth, whispered with unsettling calm. The other children listened, unsettled yet drawn in, as though he spoke not from curiosity but from certainty. And it was in that orphanage, with its cold halls and colder beds, that the first tremor appeared, the suggestion that ordinary misery was about to give way to something far darker, something that would rewrite the very air within those walls. It began as a whisper, carried on a night when the frost clung to the windows, and the dormitory air was heavy with the scent of damp wool. The boy, no more than 10, approached the orphanage keeper with eyes that did not waver. He did not ask for more food or a thicker blanket, requests that would have been met with predictable denial. Instead, he asked for something that froze the keeper where she stood, permission to sleep in the coffin stored in the cellar. At first, the staff dismissed it as mischief. A child too clever for his own good, spinning dark tales to frighten the others. Yet when laughter failed to deter him, when scolding left him unflinching, unease began to ripple through the halls. Each day he repeated the request, his voice steady, his conviction unsettling. Soon the other children caught wind of it, their whispers weaving the request into something larger than a boy's strange fancy. The coffin itself was nothing remarkable, an unfinished pine box meant for pauper burials, forgotten in the damp cellar after an epidemic claimed too many lives. Dust layered its lid, and the scent of mildew clung to its corners. When at last, wearied by his persistence, the staff dragged it up the narrow staircase, its scraping echoed like a funeral march through the building. The children watched in silence, their faces pale as though a piece of the graveyard outside had been carried into their sanctuary. That night, the boy climbed in without hesitation. He pulled the lid down, leaving only a small crack through which the lantern light pooled faintly. He did not stir, did not whimper, did not cry out for comfort as so many of the others did when nightmares came. He simply lay within, still as stone, as if the coffin had been waiting for him all along. Soon the rumors began. Some children swore they heard him speaking, a low murmur threaded with pauses, as though answering an unseen companion. Others claimed they saw shadows move across the lid, bending unnaturally in the lamplight. One girl insisted she heard laughter, faint but sharp, cutting through the silence of midnight. The matron called it hysteria, the contagious imagination of frightened children. Yet even she avoided the corner where the coffin now rested, her eyes darting to it as though it might creak open by itself. Night after night, the boy returned to his chosen bed, his small frame swallowed by the wooden box, his calm unbroken. What unnerved them most was not his strangeness, but his serenity. In a world of hunger and fear, he alone seemed at peace, as though he had already made a bargain with death and found comfort in its embrace. And in that coffin, the ordinary misery of orphanage life shifted into something darker, something the others could neither explain nor escape. At first, it was nothing more than a game, hushed voices beneath thin blankets, children daring one another to stare at the coffin after nightfall. But soon the games turned into stories and the stories into warnings. They whispered that the boy had not truly died, that he only slept, smiling faintly as if he dreamed of places no living soul had seen. A girl swore she saw his lips curl into a grin when the moonlight fell across the coffin. Another claimed his fingers twitched at dawn, restless as though trying to tap against the wood. The staff dismissed such talk with sharp words and harsh punishments. Yet the children could not be silenced. They huddled in corners, retelling their versions, each darker than the last. To them, the coffin had become a magnet, terrifying yet irresistible. Every creak of the floorboards near it, every flutter of a candle flame seemed charged with meaning, and then came the disturbances. Doors locked firmly at night would groan open to reveal nothing but cold air. Candles lit for prayers guttered and died as though pinched by invisible hands. A boy fell ill without warning, his skin grey and his breath shallow, while two others soon followed. Fear spread faster than fever. The children began to believe the coffin carried a sickness, a curse leaking into their bones. Still they returned to it, drawn by the same compulsion that makes a moth circle a flame. Some dared to touch its surface, shivering at the chill. Others lay awake, certain they heard muffled laughter echoing across the dormitory, soft, childlike, yet edged with cruelty. Each new whisper deepened the legend, weaving a net of dread that bound the orphans together. By day the coffin was avoided, left in shadow, a relic no one wished to acknowledge. By night it ruled their thoughts, shaping their dreams into twisted visions. The staff could shout, strike, or threaten, but they could not undo what the children had already created. A folklore born not from books or elders, but from fear itself. And folklore, once planted, grows roots deeper than reason. The orphanage became a place where silence carried weight, where every cough, every distant footstep made the heart quicken. The coffin was no longer wood and nails, it was a presence. It had become the unspoken center of their world, a dark heart pulsing beneath the thin veneer of daily routine. And so the whispers never ceased. They spread like vines, curling into every corner of the building, tightening their grip with each passing night. The children no longer asked if the boy might wake. Instead, they wondered how long it would take before he invited them to join him. For years, the matron of the orphanage had prided herself on her iron resolve. Death was no stranger to her halls. She had buried children felled by fever, watched famines reduce strong bodies to frail shadows, and mourned accidents that came swift as lightning. Each loss weighed upon her, yet she bore it with the grim endurance expected of a keeper of the unwanted. But the coffin child unsettled her in ways she could not explain. He did not belong to the cycle of sickness and hunger she had grown accustomed to. His presence carried a different weight, one that gnawed at the edges of her reason. By candlelight, when the others slept, she began to write. In a worn ledger meant for inventory, she recorded what she dared not speak aloud. She noted how certain children, after lingering too long near the coffin, grew pale within days. She described nights when faint whispers echoed through the dormitory, and how those who received them inevitably fell ill by morning. At first, she convinced herself it was coincidence, the natural cruelty of fate. But as the pattern sharpened, denial slipped through her fingers like water. She remembered a boy named Simon, who had been hearty as an ox. One night, she found him kneeling near the coffin, head tilted as though listening. By dawn, his fever raged. He was gone within 3 days. The matron did not tell the others, but she wrote it down, pressing her pen so hard the paper nearly tore. Each new death seemed foretold by a whisper, by some unseen exchange between the coffin and the living. Her rational mind fought back. Children had always died here. Orphans lived close to hunger, close to despair. Disease found them easily. And yet, as she walked the halls at night, she felt the air thicken near that coffin, as though the shadows themselves leaned closer to her. She swore she heard a faint laugh, not cruel, not kind, but chilling in its calmness. It was enough to make her clutch the crucifix at her neck until her knuckles blanched. Her doubts became dread. Each morning she checked the children's faces, half expecting to see the pallor of death already blooming. Each evening she stared at the coffin, waiting for the smallest sign of movement. The matron, once stern and unshakable, began to falter. The ledger grew heavy with inked confessions, a secret history of doom she could never share with the priests or the overseers. To speak it aloud would brand her mad, yet silence left her complicit in something she could not name. In her private prayers, she begged for deliverance, not only for the children but for herself, because in the darkest hours, she began to believe the whispers were not warnings at all. They were invitations calling the living closer, promising that death was not an end but a gathering, and the coffin boy was not a victim of fate. He was its herald. In 19th century America, death was not a distant concept reserved for hospitals or hidden parlors. It lived openly in the streets, the homes, and the hearts of families. Epidemics swept through towns with merciless regularity. Cholera, smallpox, diphtheria, diseases that could claim a child overnight, were constant shadows in daily life. For every 10 infants born, several would not live beyond their first year. Mothers buried children as often as they birthed them, and fathers hammered together coffins not just for neighbors, but for their own blood. The statistics were grim, but the experience was personal, carried in the silence of mourning veils and the weight of black crepe hung on doorways. From this proximity to death grew rituals meant to tame it, to weave loss into the fabric of life rather than deny it. Coffins were not symbols of horror, but of inevitability. They rested in parlors during wakes, often open, so that the dead might be seen one last time in their domestic setting. Families gathered around whispering prayers, stroking hair and placing tokens, locks of hair, flowers, or trinkets inside the casket. The line between the living and the departed was deliberately blurred, for it was believed that memory alone was not enough. One had to touch, to witness, to commune. The rise of photography in the mid-19th century only deepened this impulse. Post-mortem photography flourished as grieving parents commissioned portraits of their lifeless children. Dressed carefully, eyes sometimes painted open on the glass plate to simulate vitality. These images were not hidden in shame, but proudly displayed in family albums, reminders that the dead remained part of the household. In such a culture, the sight of a coffin did not spark immediate terror. It was a familiar vessel, a threshold between here and the hereafter. Spiritualism too crept into drawing rooms and lecture halls. Seances became fashionable gatherings, where mediums promised to bridge the gulf between the breathing and the beyond. Tapping tables, floating trumpets, disembodied voices, all suggested that the boundary between death and life was permeable. Many Americans longed to believe that those taken too soon still lingered nearby, eager to speak if only one listened closely enough. Death was not an absence, but a presence woven into the fabric of existence. Against this backdrop, the fascination of a child with a coffin acquires a sharper strangeness, yet also a peculiar believability. For adults accustomed to mourning rituals, coffins symbolized closure, remembrance, and spiritual passage. But for children, whose understanding of death was half-formed, such objects could appear as invitations, places of mystery, rather than finality. To crawl into a coffin was not merely to flirt with morbidity, it was to step into the role so many siblings, friends, and classmates had already filled. In communities where graves filled faster than school registers, play itself often mirrored burial. The macabre was not alien, it was ordinary. The orphanage, in this light, becomes more than a single haunted institution. It is a mirror of the society that built it, a society perpetually negotiating with mortality. If towns and cities draped themselves in black at the death of a mayor or a child, if parlors welcomed corpses and photographs immortalized them, why should the echoes of such practices not seep into the games, fears and fascinations of abandoned children? The boy's nightly retreat into the coffin was both aberration and reflection, a personal obsession amplified by a collective culture steeped in death. And so the matron's dread, the children's whispers, and the creeping sense of foreboding within the orphanage did not rise in isolation. They were born from a century already haunted, where the living and the dead shared parlors, photographs, and whispered prayers. If America itself carried death at its shoulder, how could its children do otherwise? The first cough was faint, almost dismissible, the kind of sound one hears in crowded dormitories where cold drafts creep through broken windows. But by the following week, it grew into a chorus, a hacking, rasping music that echoed through the narrow halls of the orphanage. Children doubled over in their bunks, their bodies racked with fever. Some burned with such heat that their skin glistened as if slick with oil. Others shivered despite the weight of every blanket the matron could scavenge. When blood stained the pillowcases, bright and jarring against the dim candlelight, fear settled in like a second sickness. The matron tried to keep order, but terror ran faster than her authority. Every hour another child collapsed, another bowl of broth was left untouched, another prayer whispered in desperate secrecy. Disease had always been a familiar guest in such places, but this was different. It was merciless, accelerating, cutting down children in clusters as though the air itself had turned predatory. And through it all, one figure remained curiously untouched, the boy in the coffin. While his peers twisted and moaned in fever, he lay in his wooden bed, calm, his breath even, his gaze steady. His pallor remained unchanged, neither flushed with fever nor drained with illness. When the matron demanded to know how he could stay so composed amidst so much ruin, his answer chilled her marrow. "It cannot take me," he said softly, his voice almost tender. "I already belong to the coffin. Death does not claim what is already its own." At first she dismissed the words as childish fancy, the kind of eerie poetry that fevered imaginations sometimes produce. But the more she observed, the less she could deny the pattern. Children he shared whispers with in the night were the first to collapse come morning. Those who mocked his coffin ritual now lay silent under sheets drawn up to their chins. The boy himself grew neither weaker nor weary. If anything, his composure deepened, as though each passing death confirmed his place outside the reach of ordinary flesh. The staff began to avoid him, their eyes darting away, muttering prayers under their breath as they passed. Some claimed they saw shadows lengthen unnaturally around his coffin. Others swore they heard laughter, soft, muffled, not entirely his own, rising from within the wooden box as sickness devoured the dormitory. Yet no one dared confront him. Fear and exhaustion shackled them into silence. The matron, who had prided herself on stern reason, found her composure unraveling. She began to write in her journal by candlelight, her hand trembling as she documented each death, each whisper, each unexplainable detail. Her entries grew darker with every page. "He is not sick. He will not be sick. He has chosen, or has been chosen." For the first time, she wondered whether the boy's coffin was not a symbol of morbidity, but a sanctuary, a barrier that even the plague dared not breach. By the third week, the orphanage was quieter than a crypt. Beds once filled with restless bodies now held stillness. The smell of sickness lingered in the boards, acrid and sour, but the boy's corner remained serene, almost untouched by the ruin surrounding it. He sat up at night, watching, waiting, as if aware that the matron's eyes searched him for answers she could not bear to receive. And though her mind screamed for reason, her heart whispered the truth she dreaded. The coffin child was not merely surviving. He was marked untouchable, suspended between the living and the dead. The plague had revealed what whispers alone could not. He was no ordinary orphan. He was something else, something the matron could neither name nor deny. Years later, when the orphanage was little more than a ruin swallowed by weeds, scattered voices began to surface, testimonies from those who had endured its walls and lived to tell the tale. Their accounts, half-whispered and often contradictory, stitched together a tapestry of memory that blurred the line between history and legend. One woman, long since grown, recalled a night when fever had nearly consumed her. "I remember him leaning close," she said, her voice trembling in old age. "He whispered something, I couldn't make out the words. By dawn, my fever broke. The others died, but I lived. I think he saved me." Her eyes watered as she spoke, though she admitted she could never bring herself to repeat the phrase she thought she heard. Another orphan, less forgiving, swore the opposite. "If you looked into that coffin, you were marked. I saw my friend dare it, just once lifting the lid to laugh at him. 3 days later, she was gone. Not sick at first, just gone. The coffin didn't hold him. It held something else, and if you peered inside, it saw you back." The most chilling recollections came from a janitor who had worked at the orphanage until its final days. Bent with age, his hands gnarled from years of sweeping floors, he spoke of long nights when the halls were too quiet, save for the boys' strange murmurs. "I heard him talking," the old man said, "but it wasn't just him. 2 voices. One soft and childish, the other deeper, like gravel dragging across stone. The second voice always came when the lid was closed. I told myself it was my imagination, but I never dared check." His testimony ended with a nervous laugh, though his eyes revealed no mirth, only the hollow stare of a man who had carried fear for decades. Fragments of these stories began to circulate in regional papers, never with enough weight to prove fact, but always enough to unsettle. Journalists dismissed them as the half-truths of traumatized children, memories warped by disease and loss. Yet within local folklore, they rooted deep. Retold around firelight and kitchen tables, the boy who whispered salvation, the coffin that cursed those who peered inside, the phantom voice that spoke through wood. These testimonies gave the story its peculiar power. They refused to resolve neatly into either miracle or horror. Instead, they left listeners suspended between awe and dread, wondering whether the boy was chosen by death to deliver warnings, or whether he was a vessel, something darker using him as its host. By the time the orphanage was abandoned, its survivors had scattered across the country. Some tried to forget, burying the memory as deeply as the graves of those who never left. Others leaned into the legend, convinced their survival was proof that the boy had touched them with something otherworldly. Whatever their stance, none could speak of him without the weight of trembling pauses, as if the memory itself carried risk. The boy in the coffin had become more than a child. Through their testimonies, he became a haunting echo, shaping a legend that could never be entirely dismissed nor fully explained. The storm struck without warning, a sudden violence that rattled the ancient timbers of the orphanage. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder bellowed like a beast clawing at the heavens, and the children huddled in silence, clutching their blankets in fear. Yet amid that chaos, one bed lay empty, the boy's. No one heard him rise, no one saw him walk. But by dawn, his absence was undeniable. The matron, pale and trembling, led the children into the chapel, where the boy's coffin had long rested as a cruel reminder of his obsession with death. Its lid, once heavy and shut tight, now gaped open. The satin within was smooth and undisturbed, as though no body had ever lain there. His small form had vanished without footprint, without struggle, without sound. Only the scent of damp wood and a faint trace of soil clung to the air, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Rumors bloomed like rot. Some whispered that the matron, weary of his strange habits, had buried him in secret to end the terror once and for all. Others swore they had seen a shadowed figure walking the corridors that night, small and hunched, trailing raindrops though no door had opened. The most dreadful tale insisted he had been claimed by the very death he adored, that some unholy pact had been fulfilled, and the storm was the herald of his passage. The orphanage never escaped the stain of that night. Families withdrew their children, horrified by the whispers that something unnatural dwelt within those walls. Attendance dwindled, donations dried to nothing, and the once proud building decayed into silence. Windows shattered, beams sagged, and ivy coiled around the bricks like veins feeding on its ruin. By the turn of the century, it was condemned, a carcass of stone and wood standing only to remind the town of what had been lost. Yet the story endured. Locals claimed that on storm-lashed nights, the sound of tiny footsteps could still be heard pacing through the crumbling halls. Some swore the coffin remained in the chapel, though no living soul dared to open it again. And children, daring each other on moonless evenings, would peer through broken panes and swear they saw him, the coffin child, pale as mist, watching with eyes that had no age, no warmth, no end. The town carried on, but its heart had been pierced. The boy who longed for the grave had found it, or perhaps something far stranger, and in his vanishing he left behind more than silence. He left behind a question that gnawed at the edges of faith, a reminder that death is not always the final word. For some, it is only the beginning of the story. And so the orphanage fell to ruin, the boy became a legend, and the storm of 1877 echoed across generations. In the absence of a body, only myth remained, and myths, unlike children, never die. The tale ends not with answers, but with an emptiness that refuses to be filled. The image of the coffin, standing open and abandoned, carries more weight than the boy's entire life, for within its wooden frame lay the heart of the mystery. Why would a child choose to rest where only the dead belong? To some, the coffin was sanctuary, his escape from the cruelty of life, his attempt to cradle himself in the silence of eternity. To others, it was curse, an invitation to forces best left untouched, a portal into darkness that devoured him whole. In the fading years of the 19th century, such symbols held terrible power. Death was everywhere, in the fevers that swept through villages, in the mines that swallowed men, in the wars that ground families into dust. Coffins were not distant objects reserved for the elderly. They were part of daily life, looming in parlors, in churchyards, in whispered stories meant to hush restless children. For a boy to claim one as his bed blurred the fragile boundary between the living and the dead, and made him into something other than either. The town could not explain him, and so it feared him. The matron could not control him, and so she buried his story in half-truths. The children could not understand him, and so they turned his presence into legend. And as years passed, the coffin itself ceased to be just wood and nails. It became a vessel of meaning, a stage on which grief and superstition performed their endless play. Even now, when the orphanage is nothing but rubble and ivy, the boy's image lingers like a ghost pressed into the soil. People who speak of him do not debate the facts. Those have long since rotted away. Instead, they circle the symbol, unable to shake the feeling that his choice carried a warning. Was he victim, a child broken by neglect and death's constant nearness? Or was he omen, sent to remind the living that they too would one day lie where he so willingly rested? The coffin as sanctuary, the coffin as curse, two truths locked in the same wooden box. Perhaps that is why the story has survived when so many others have not. Because in the end, the boy was not just a child of his century, but a mirror of it. He embodied an age that lived under death's shadow. When mourning clothes hung as common as Sunday best, and when folklore sprouted wherever sorrow refused explanation. And so the image remains, a frail boy choosing to curl inside a coffin instead of a bed, as if sleep and death were one and the same. Ordinary timber transformed into a doorway, a threshold no one else dared cross. The silence around him becomes the loudest echo, and his absence becomes the most haunting presence of all. In that silence, the story closes, but never truly ends.